Hello, thank you all for joining us today. My name is Celinda Adair. I'm the State National Flood Insurance Program Coordinator for the State of Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development, or DLCD. Today's presentation is going to be on the National Flood Insurance Program and substantial damage requirements, how to conduct substantial damage determinations after a disaster event for any structures that are damaged inside of a FEMA mapped floodplain, regardless of the type of event. Today's focus will be on post-wildfire situations. My co-presenter today is Mitch Paine from FEMA Region 10, and I'll pass it over to him to introduce himself.
Thanks, Linda. Yep, my name is Mitch Paine, and I'm a floodplain management specialist with FEMA Region 10, and I primarily work with Oregon communities on the National Flood Insurance Program. So just as an overview, the National Flood Insurance Program, it's been around a little more than 50 years. I assume you're listening because your community participates in the National Flood Insurance Program. And just a quick reminder that the NFIP exists as sort of a partnership between FEMA and local governments, where FEMA makes flood insurance available as long as communities commit and implement their floodplain regulations. And as part of that, it includes regulations for new or substantially improved structures, which we'll get into. And it's also good to remember the fact that flood insurance is mandatory for any buildings or properties that have a federally backed mortgage that are located in the floodplain. And so just as a quick recap of some of the basic terms, and this would be good to refer to if you want to come back to it. The base flood is what we call the 1% annual chance event, or the 100-year flood. And then we refer to the base flood elevation as the level that the floodwaters are expected to reach during that base flood, or the 100-year flood. So often we call this the 100-year flood elevation, but officially it's the base flood elevation. You should be familiar with your flood insurance rate maps, and these are the official FEMA maps that demonstrate the flood risk for a community or a set of communities. And then the flood insurance study often accompanies these flood insurance rate maps, and this is the FEMA official report, and it provides all of the supporting documentation and information, and it's also where we generate the base flood elevations in many cases, particularly along rivers. Freeboard we'll talk about and we'll include throughout this presentation, but Freeboard is an elevation standard that communities include in their own local regulations that might be a standard higher than the base flood elevation. And this is where buildings must be elevated or flood-proofed to the Freeboard standard that might be above the base flood elevation. And then lastly, this is a term we use interchangeably with the floodplain, but officially it's called the special flood hazard area. And this is the area that's expected to be underwater in the event of a 1% annual chance flood or a base flood. And so all local regulations in Oregon are required to at least follow what's in the Oregon Model Ordinance. This Model Ordinance was updated in August of 2019. And you can find it on DLCD's website if you want to go back and refer to it. And so in that Model Ordinance, and what should be in your own local ordinances, are these two definitions. And these definitions will really provide the foundation for how we deal with substantial damage. So the first one is substantial damage itself. And I'm going to read it out loud, and we're going to go through in each and every piece of it. So substantial damage is damage of any origin sustained by a structure where the cost of restoring the structure to its before damage condition would equal or exceed 50% of the market value of the structure before the damage occurred. And this is really all it is. This is what substantial damage is. And we're going to break down each of those pieces and see and make sure we all understand how it applies to various applications of it in a post-disaster situation. Substantial improvement is a connected definition, and it's important to remember that these are connected. A substantially improved building includes a building that has incurred substantial damage. And it's important to note that considered substantial improvement even if the actual repair work isn't actually performed. And we'll get into that in the next few slides. So another quick reminder, in the model ordinance and in your local ordinance, a floodplain development permit is going to be required for anything. So whether that's someone constructing a new building or doing a substantial improvement on a new building or any other aspect to their property. If it's in the special flood hazard area or the floodplain development permit's required. You may have this embedded in another permitting process like your building permit or some sort of land use permit, but something akin to this will be in your floodplain ordinance. And then where we find the requirement for substantial improvement and substantial damage, it really applies itself when we look at the requirements for the different types of buildings. So this is an example here for residential construction. It says new construction and substantial improvements of any residential structure must be elevated to the base flood elevation or the freeboard standard. And you'll find that similar language in the code sections that talk about non-residential construction and other types of buildings. So that's kind of where you're going to find all of these pieces in your code or in your floodplain management regulations to kind of be able to tie them all together when inevitably an applicant asks you to show them where it says in your code where this is required. So what does this really mean? We kind of connected the dots in the code. What this means is that any substantially damaged structure that is caused by any source has to be brought into compliance with whatever your current regulations are. And as part of that, at the end of the project, there needs to be the certification of elevations from a surveyor. Often this is on an elevation certificate, but you might have another form that you use that demonstrates that full compliance, that the lowest floor is to the base flood elevation or the freeboard, and that any crawl space or anything down below meets the standards too. And where this really plays out in practice is if a home was built either before the first flood maps came into effect in your community, or say it was built after the first flood maps and the BFEs went up as a result of a map change. That's where a substantially damaged house, for example, would have to be rebuilt or repaired to be in compliance with the current standards and the current base flood elevations. So say a house has the lowest floor as it was before it was damaged by fire, as an example, and that lowest floor was 3 feet below the base flood elevation. And maybe that's a slab on grade house. So the flood depths here are 3 feet. Then when they come in to request a permit to rebuild that structure as part of your substantial damage regulations, you have to make sure that that property owner is proposing a new house or a repaired house where the lowest floor is 3 feet higher than it was before, where that lowest floor is at or above the BFE or your freeboard standard. And in a manufactured dwelling park, what this might actually look like for repaired, substantially damaged buildings may be kind of a redesign of some of the individual lots. If there's a requirement or a need for a long set of stairs or a ramp, some of the pads might have to be readjusted or sort of redesigned so that they can actually meet the floodplain management requirements. So this substantial improvement and substantial damage requirements are, admittedly very tough things for local governments to implement. And they're among the toughest of the standards that we have in local floodplain regulations. But it's really important to remember that they are required. This is a key and fundamental piece of the National Flood Insurance Program floodplain regulations. And what it really does is it makes sure that where there is an opportunity for people to rebuild in a better way, that property for the families that occupy the house or building in the future are going to see fewer flood losses. There's going to be, incredible savings on flood insurance if they were paying it before and they're paying it again now. And that means in future flooding events, whenever they might occur, elevated buildings, recover faster. Those families recover faster and the community overall recovers faster. And that obviously translates into reduced disaster costs, which is a key part of why the National Flood Insurance Program exists. And then fundamentally, a house is typically a family's biggest investment, and making sure that the house is as safe as possible protects the family and their investment that they've made into the building. And there definitely are costs of a community not complying with these requirements for substantial damage. Obviously, it's evident that a house that's allowed to be rebuilt out of compliance below the BFE as it was before it was damaged means that it's just going to get flooded in the future. We know that. We're going to see that. This house may have seen it in the past. So it's important to keep that in mind. And because it's a key and fundamental requirement of the National Flood Insurance Program, the community risks being suspended from the National Flood Insurance Program by not applying these regulations appropriately. And obviously what that means is that homeowners with mortgages, if the community is suspended from the NFIP, that means that homeowners with mortgages will lose their mortgage because they can't get flood insurance if the community is not a community in good standing in the National Flood Insurance Program. And then if the community is not in the program, there is less disaster assistance available for the community, both for the community and individuals in the future. So it's really important that these be applied as best as possible so that communities stay in good standing with the program. And communities that do this well know that and they can stand confident that applying substantial damage regulations protects properties, reduces the taxpayer burden, and make sure that this disaster and any future disaster, there's a faster recovery. So let's break down substantial damage. When I read off the definition of before, it contained 4 pieces. This here of substantial damage can be caused by any source, whether it's flooding, wildfires, earthquakes, and we'll get into each of these. Then the 50% rule and how we make that calculation. And then we'll look at the costs of repair, what's to be included, what's not to be included, and how you make those costs, or how you require those costs to be made. And then the market value. So we'll walk through each of those in the next couple of slides. So the first thing is substantial damage. It doesn't matter what caused the damage, the substantial damage rules apply. So in this case, we're dealing with lots of wildfire damage structures. And while it's not flooding, it still has to be, the substantial damage rules still have to be applied. So we see this when there's flood damage, often when there's fire damage, wind damage, earthquake, even if a car hits a house and knocks a bunch of walls down, that counts. And so when we look at the 50% rule, it's a pretty straightforward calculation. You look at the cost to repair the damage, regardless of whether those repairs are being made, and then you compare that to the pre-event market value. We'll break each of those down in the next couple slides, and then you look at that ratio. And if that ratio is higher than 50%, then it's considered substantially damaged. If it's lower than 50%, then it's not. And some of your communities may have a different threshold. They may have a different 50% rule. So just be sure to look at your floodplain regulations so you know that. And so let's look at an example. If a house is the market value before the damage is $150,000 just for the house, and the fire causes $90,000 of damage, and that's what we figured out it's going to cost, then you just simply look at that calculation. $90,000 divided by $150,000 is 0.6. Multiply that by 100, gets us a percentage of 60%. And then that's a very clear, substantially damaged property. So then when we look at that equation and we try to break down each of those components, the first thing is trying to figure out what the costs of repair should include. And really what this means is any damage costs to any part of the building itself. So we're looking at the roof, the walls, the doors, the windows, electrical systems, HVAC systems, any other built-in appliances all count as repair costs that need to be included here. And then when we look at the cost to actually do the repair, they have to include both the material and the labor costs. And the big thing here, and where this gets can get a little bit tricky, is when any part of the rebuild might be done by either the labor or the materials of the owner, or if they're donated materials. Even if they're donated or being done by volunteers or the owner themselves, they have to have some sort of market value of those materials and labors as part of the permit to make sure that this equation is fully fleshed out. And then also what must be included are any other improvements. If as they repair the house, they're going to add a deck, those have to be included as part of the total cost of repair, the total cost of the improvements as well. And there are a couple things that can be excluded. So, sort of temporary emergency measures can be excluded from the costs. Some of the interior contents can be excluded, relocation costs, and anything that's not attached to the house. So landscaping, sidewalks, decks that aren't attached to the house, those can be not included in the cost of repair. And one thing we'll make evident, I think in the next slide here, is a spreadsheet that's an example of what you could require from the property owners to demonstrate what these costs are. And on the right side of this slide, you see the substantial improvement and substantial damage desk reference. This is a fantastic FEMA resource that goes through all of this in great detail. If you have a question about any of the components of the repair, you're gonna find the answers here. So we're gonna show this multiple times. Please download it, print it off, whatever you need to do to make this available to you. Then the second part of that equation is looking at what the market value of the structure prior to the damage was. And that's a really important thing, and sometimes it can get a little tricky to apply. So unfortunately, the NFIP and FEMA, we don't define what market value is. We just kind of provide guidance on what you should use in your community. Every community is a little bit different, so you're gonna have to assess which is the most applicable. Big things to keep in mind are you're only using the value of the structure, not the entire property. So try to find that in the market value. And then you're using the value of the structure before the damage occurred. So even if it's a couple years after, you're still using that pre-damage value for the market value. And so in general, there are kind of these three typically acceptable ways we use to demonstrate and determine market value. We can use the assessed value, that's an easy resource and an easy set of data that you can get. When it gets close to 50%, typically, you look at the adjusted market value and talk to your county assessor for information on exactly what that means. We can get into that if any of you need more help. Then if it's applicable and if it's useful, you can use estimates of a structure's actual cash value. And that's kind of the value of the building and the materials itself. And that typically includes depreciation. This can be used when assessed value isn't a great resource. And then as a last resort, you can always use appraisals. Often property owners will bring appraisals in, and those are perfectly acceptable to use as long as you feel that it's a valid appraisal. So whether that appraiser is licensed and it sort of passes a sniff test. Talk more about that if you need. The main thing here with market value is just making sure that you're using the same type of market value for all properties. So what most communities do is they just use the assessed value for everything, every property. And then if a property owner has an appraisal or gets one on their own, that can be used as a more accurate market value than the assessed value. Big thing is just making sure it's consistent. So what we're going to do now is, those are the key components of substantial damage. And what we want to do now is kind of transition into some of the other main floodplain requirements and how substantial damage fits into them or other aspects of this disaster. So, the big thing and what you deal with most of all is applying floodplain management regulations to new or substantially improved buildings. So if a reconstructed house is being proposed, then it's really important to make sure that you're making the property owner elevate that new or repaired structure so its lowest floor is at the base flood elevation or whatever your freeboard is. And so in a lot of cases, that means that houses are going to be built on crawl spaces. And so the other thing you have to make sure is that the crawl spaces have flood openings that meet the 1 square inch of openings to 1 square foot of enclosed space in that crawl space. We look at net area in those calculations. And if a house is being elevated on stilts of some sort, piles or piers, then that's a perfectly acceptable foundation style too. And the other thing is making sure that the proposed building utility systems, like the electrical, the heating, air conditioning systems, the ductwork, are also elevated or dry flood proofed to the base flood elevation or the freeboard. And that's a really important piece. And sometimes the permitting systems that you'll have don't necessarily tie those together. So make sure you catch that when you're looking at substantially damaged and repaired properties. And then, similarly for non-residential buildings, we're applying these same standards, including the requirement to be dry flood proofed if the building owner, the non-residential building owner, wants to do that. So another thing, another development type that your community might face is manufactured dwellings. And if these are substantially damaged, the rules for manufactured dwellings apply. And in your floodplain management regulations, you should have something specific to manufactured dwellings. The big thing here is that the bottom of the chassis frame, the longitudinal chassis frame, has to be at the base flood elevation or higher, or to your freeboard standard. And then if any of you are dealing with coastal floodplains, this is actually 1 foot above the BFE or to your freeboard standard. So make sure you find that in your floodplain management regulations and apply that. The other key thing about manufactured dwellings is that they have to be anchored down. There's a couple different ways to do that, but they have to be anchored down so that the buildings don't float away, they don't collapse during the event of a flood, and then they don't just move off their foundations during flooding. And then any sort of electrical crossover connections, you also have to make sure that those are elevated to 1 foot above the base flood elevation. And then this doesn't quite get at substantial damage, but I know it's going to be something that comes up in our post-disaster world is recreational vehicles. The key thing to remember here is if these are going to be placed in the floodplain, they have to be licensed and ready for roadway use, and they have to be on site for 180 days or less. Those two components have to be there, and that's a really important thing because recreational vehicles, don't have to, if they're on site for 180 days or less and road ready, they don't have to be anchored down necessarily. And so that's a real big risk for people that might be living in them as their sort of temporary housing while their house is rebuilt. And if someone does want to place their RV in the floodplain for longer than 180 days, then you essentially have to treat them and regulate them as manufactured dwellings. So they have to be elevated to the base flood elevation and anchored down. And then if any of these are going to be placed in the floodway, you still have to require a no-rise to be done. So that gets us to the floodway requirements. The big thing to remember is for any substantially improved house or other building, if it's in a floodway, you have to make sure that a no-rise analysis is done. And we do that through the hydrologic and hydraulic, the H&H analysis. And that has to be a key factor of this. And remember too that, we don't allow the concept of a floodway shadow to be used as part of these analyses. So the big thing to know as you're looking at substantial damage is know where your floodway properties are so you can make sure that this additional requirement is placed there and that the property owners know. So a big question that's going to come up, and it's probably brewing in your mind already, is, well, what about variances or exceptions to this rule? Big thing to remember is that variances absolutely should not be granted from these substantial damage or substantial improvement requirements. While people are, may see this as an economic hardship, and hardships are in the variance criteria, an economic hardship just because it's expensive is not a good reason for a variance. And FEMA does not allow that, and it will be treated as a violation if it is granted. The only exception that we see are for historic structures. Those are really going to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. If you have any, or you think you have any, reach out to Celinda or I, and we can help walk you through what this exception might be. The other thing is, an exception for a historic structure is going to need costly flood insurance. So there's a lot of factors to go into evaluating this. And just a reminder that if there's any violations to your floodplain management regulations, the community could be at risk if those violations aren't corrected. And unfortunately, in a post-disaster world, whether it's post-flood or post-wildfire, this is where violations pop up so often. And we want to make sure that you all have the tools that you need to be able to apply this really well so you don't have violations. Violations are anything that doesn't meet the minimum standards in your code. So someone rebuilds at grade and they don't elevate their property and it's substantially damaged, then that's a violation. And if it's not corrected, the community could be put on probation and ultimately suspended from the NFIP. And so I just want to make another plug for this desk reference. In this desk reference, you're going to find a lot of information about all of these requirements and some of the specifics here. It's going to give you tips and tricks on how to apply this in greater detail. And then there are some templates for letters and other notifications that you can use. We're also going to post some of these templates that we have kind of amended for wildfire on, I think, the DLCD website, so you'll be able to find them there too. But make sure you grab this desk reference. This is going to be your best friend as we work through the post-wildfire recovery. So be sure to get this. And now I'm going to turn it over to Celinda, and we'll go through, she'll walk through some of the community responsibilities.
Thanks, Mitch. So after an event happens, there are some key community responsibilities that you'll want to be aware of. The first and major one is to communicate with your emergency management staff and the other people at your agency to track and assess the damage to substantially damaged structures that are within floodplain areas. It's key that even if it's not a flood, in situations like this where it's a wildfire, that you do the work to determine what structures in your floodplain were damaged and that you follow through with the process we're going to talk about here. The other is to make sure that you're implementing your floodplain regulations for any reconstructions, rebuilding work, any repairs, so that you don't rebuild or repair in a way that will get you out of compliance with the NFIP. And I'm going to dive into each of these a little deeper in a moment in the following slides. Ensuring floodplain permits are obtained, that's part of making sure you're applying your regulations. Can't apply them if you don't know the work's happening. Providing notice of substantial damage to property owners, helping people that have structures that were damaged in the floodplain understand what that means for their properties, helping them understand what substantial damage means and what it means for their rebuilding efforts. Identifying and making available floodplain mapping information. So there's a lot of information online on FEMA's Map Service Center website and other places where people can type in their address and see really easily if they're in a flood plain and if this is going to apply to them. You should also have information available on hand that you can provide them as a community representative. And last but not least, maintain files on all the development in the special flood hazard area. It's very important that as you identify properties as being substantially damaged, that you make a record in their files so that if they decide not to rebuild for 5 to 10 years and they come back, you won't have lost the fact that they were substantially damaged in the disaster event. So just for a little refresher, what does doing substantial damage determinations really involve on a property by property basis? As you're looking at structures, you're really going to assess, first off, is the building in a special flood hazard area? If it's not, then you do not need to do the substantial damage determination. This is only for properties that are in that special flood hazard area, your riverine or coastal flood zones, your floodways, and for that 1% annual chance or 100-year flood. So if the answer is yes, then what you're going to be assessing is the structure substantially damaged? And that's when you're going to be doing the calculation that Mitch went over earlier, where you're comparing the cost to repair the structure versus the current pre-disaster or pre-damage event market value of the building. If the cost to repair is more than 50%, then you need to go forward to the next step, which is communicating with that property owner about the requirements for that building to be brought into compliance with current floodplain regulations when they rebuild or they repair. If it is not more than 50%, it still needs a floodplain permit. It's still subject to substantial improvement requirements, but it is not going to be determined as substantial damage. Now, to get into the nitty-gritty for all of you floodplain administrators that are watching this, it's really important that you understand what your role is. So as Mitch alluded to in the Oregon Model Flood Hazard Ordinance and in your local codes, there's requirements that you as floodplain administrators do substantial damage work that you do, as we talked about before, inventory what structures within your community's floodplain were damaged by an event. And this could be an event like we've just had, the wildfires. It could be a one-off house fire. It could be a flood, a wind event. We get lots of those here in Oregon. It could be a lot of different things that have caused the damage, but it is up to you as a floodplain administrator to track and be working with your emergency managers to pay attention to when structures in your floodplain are substantially damaged. And what we recommend is that you obtain maps or GIS information, whatever your community has the capacity to do, to help you track that. And what we can provide, and we'll be sending out to communities when disaster situations happen, are some tracking spreadsheets that will help you compile the following information for each structure, which is really the address. The assessed market value is typically what we have here, although if you have another way of calculating market value, you could put that in as well. The age of construction, so that you know if it was put in place before your floodplain regulations took effect or if it was there afterwards, so whether it was probably built in compliance in the first place. The type of structure, residential or non-residential, it's really important to make that determination. And other information can be helpful when it's available. In all cases, it's not, but when you have it, you can add it in, like the type of foundation. The other thing you want to do is look at options for coordinating with building officials or emergency managers or others at your agency or other agencies that are going out into the field to assess the damage. And in the case of a wildfire, like the situation we have right now, you may be doing more of a virtual assessment using GIS data and aerial satellite imagery to compare it with the fire boundaries and your property parcel boundaries to see what structures are damaged in a fire. In a lot of cases, it typically is more clear when damage has occurred than if it's a post-flood event. But it is key to work with others to make sure you're getting access to the information you need and help to determine which structures in your community did have substantial damage or some level of damage, and that you're tracking those structures. Now, the next really key role and duty as a floodplain administrator is to try to prepare and distribute outreach information that's going to inform residents on a couple of things. One is making sure people that have structures within a floodplain or property within a floodplain are clear that if they do any rebuilding or repair work, anything that involves grading, fill, excavation, so debris cleanup if it involves bulldozers and really digging into the ground or piling up large piles of debris can count. Anything in the floodplain that qualifies as development does need a floodplain permit before they start that work. And it's really to make sure that when they're rebuilding or doing work that they stay in compliance with the local floodplain regulations that are there to protect them in the event of a flood. Disaster-specific outreach is also extremely important. There is a significant increased risk of flooding and mud flows after a fire. The ground, it's like baked earth. It doesn't absorb water. The vegetation isn't there to absorb water. There's a lot more debris and things that can get caught up into the waters and create mud flows that can really make the risk of flooding after a fire much greater. And so getting that awareness out to your residents is really important so that they stay protected. With the current wildfires, they've come right at the kind of entryway to this year's flood season. And so that getting that messaging out there quickly is going to be very necessary and relevant. The other is the importance of purchasing flood insurance, whether it's a flood event or not. At some point, whatever is built there or rebuilt there is going to be subject to flood risk if it's in a floodplain. And so it's very important they have flood insurance so that if they do receive damages, they have some level of protection. You don't want to see people re-victimized. They were hit by the fires, they rebuilt, and they get hit by a flood and don't have insurance to protect them. That's a worst case scenario. So having flood insurance really helps protect them when it comes to being able to recover and be resilient in the event of a flood. The next thing you want to do on the outreach side is to get the word out about what substantial damage determination really means for them. So you want to let them know, yes, you need floodplain permits. You need to come in and talk to us. If you're in a floodplain and you're going to rebuild, have a conversation with you as a local and the resident. And some of the ways you can do that is to do things like press releases, letters. It's hard after wildfire in some cases to do letters because there's no mailboxes to send them to. There's no structure to post a notice on. So sometimes there's creative solutions like signs at the entranceway to manufactured home parks or housing developments. There's getting the word out on social media. Really, whatever networks and ways your community has to interact with residents, use them. You know best how to reach your community members, but be sure to get the word out about the topics I already mentioned, but also about the substantial damage assessments and determinations and what that means. If somebody's property is substantially damaged, that determination is made. What does it mean for them when they have to rebuild? Like Mitch talked about, it means they have to bring their structure or their new structure as they're rebuilding into compliance with the current floodplain regulations. If it's an old single wide or a very old structure that's been there for many years before your floodplain regulations took effect, this might mean a significant change to what has to be there on the ground when they rebuild compared with what was there before. That can mean elevating structures and a lot of things. So it is really important to communicate to them so they understand what they're really facing when they're rebuilding. When you're doing your substantial damage determinations, you're really triaging to put them into 3 buckets. They're clearly substantially damaged. There's nothing left. They're not substantially damaged. It's pretty much remained untouched. They're very lucky. Or it potentially is. There's some damage, but it's not clear how much without doing a really detailed inspection. For anything in the middle, you're going to really determine how bad the damage was when they come in for permits, when they come in to actually rebuild, and you can look at detailed information. That's why it's so important to get the word out that they do need to come in for floodplain permits, that there are requirements they may have to comply with, they may have to build back differently than they did before. Now, the cost of repair worksheets and other forms that Mitch has already covered are there to help people understand what costs they have to include to help you do kind of substantial improvement assessments to say, okay, when you're rebuilding, how much work is actually required to bring this back up to safe standards. And at that point, it'll help you make an actual determination regarding whether the property was substantially damaged and whether it's being substantially improved for those ones that were, potential. Now, the next thing is with those notices, we have some examples that we're going to provide and post online on the DLCD website and send out via email that are template press releases, letters, or other notices that you can use. So the one that's on the left of your screen is directly from the FEMA guidebook that Mitch has mentioned already. And the other is an updated version we did related to this wildfire event. And these are plug and play ready. As you can see, you can just put in the community's name or information. There's a whole host of these we're going to try to provide to you via the website so that you can use them to help get the word out with as little effort as possible, as I know you guys all have a lot going on already. So a couple other really important things for you to take into consideration and do now is talking to your elected officials regarding the floodplain development permit fees and any potential fee waivers they would consider to help lighten the burden on those that have to rebuild within a floodplain area. There are some cases they will reduce fees or waive them, but obviously that's a conversation for the elected officials. The other is to review the post-wildfire floodplain permitting process. If there's ways you can expedite your permitting process while still making sure that anything being rebuilt is done in compliance with your regulations, and also still making sure that you're evaluating it for compliance with your local regulations, then that's a good way to look at it. What can you do to make things go faster while still ticking all the boxes you need to? And that's something we can always provide you some guidance or assistance with on a one-on-one basis. The other thing is to highlight to your manager and elected officials about substantial damage provisions and the fact that you have this whole body of work that you have to do. You have to do substantial damage determinations and assessments. You have to track the situation for these properties. You'll have to process floodplain permits for rebuilding activities. That can be a significant amount of work depending on the number of structures damaged. And if it's a wildfire event like this recent event or something that's non-flood related, a lot of times your elected officials or other parties aren't going to be aware that these requirements come into play or the amount of work it comes in. So be sure to message upward what this will take from you, and be sure to reach out to us and FEMA and our partners for any assistance you need with this, because you don't have to go through that effort alone. We are here to support you. The next thing is record keeping. This is extremely important, really, for two different reasons. One, because if you keep highly detailed records of your staff time and the resources you use to do this work, you can get partial 75% reimbursement potentially under the Disaster Recovery Reform Act 1206 section. And it can be used in a lot of cases for things like building code enforcement or substantial damage determination work. So there is some potential for reimbursement from the federal government for this work if you keep highly detailed records of who is doing the work, the date they did the work, what specifically they did. You can't be too detailed in this situation. The other real important reason for good record keeping is to make sure you're compiling the information about which structures were substantially damaged, photos or videos, into a community repository. It can be a single one, and also to be sure that you get that information or some notice or record of the fact that that structure is substantially damaged into your individual property permit files, so that any time going forward, if somebody comes in and applies for a permit, it's not going to be missed that it was substantially damaged. A couple other things I wanted to touch on were, after major disasters, there is FEMA funding through the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program if a presidential disaster has been declared, and other funding from other agencies that can be used for recovery and mitigation projects. Where this is important is, as Mitch touched on, sometimes you'll have situations like single-wide manufactured home parks with very small lots where rebuilding the same way it was there before isn't allowed because you now have to elevate structures and you have stairs or ramps that are required. And in order to redesign them or potentially to buy out portions of them that are in a floodway or a floodplain, you can use FEMA funds with some match or other funding sources to try to do that and address your flood risks, so that when you build back, you're safer, you're more resilient in the case of a future flood. There's also a couple other considerations. Even though wildfires, they are a natural disaster, you still have to consider floodplains as well. And so while people may not be thinking of a wildfire disaster as something that needs to have a floodplain component, it is when you come to the rebuilding side. And so it can be a struggle sometimes for local floodplain managers to get themselves into the conversation, but please make every effort to do that, to whenever there are structures that were damaged in the floodplain, even though the disaster is something like a wildfire or some other type of disaster or event. The other really important time for you to have a voice in the conversation as floodplain managers is the emergency housing. What we really want to avoid is any re-victimization. We don't want people that are impacted from a flood being put in temporary emergency housing situations in a way that would put them at risk for a flood event if they were just subject to one, or if they were subject to a wildfire, as we are now in many cases. So it's really important that people that are working on emergency and temporary housing at your community are aware that there is a floodplain component. If they are looking at properties in a floodplain or a floodway, they need to understand what the requirements are to build something there safely to avoid re-victimization. And also just to be aware of the upcoming risks and how much that flood risk increases after a fire. So the areas identified at risk now may not truly reflect on your current maps what the risk is. It may be bigger, there may be additional areas, especially downstream from burned scar areas. So just as a wrap up, the key things as local communities and local floodplain managers that need to do here after a wildfire event, a flood event, any type of disaster where structures within a floodplain are impacted and you're dealing with substantial damage, to review floodplain development and building permits that come in, make sure people are applying for them, get the word out about that, and make sure that you're reviewing them and applying your current regulations in compliance with the substantial damage and substantial improvement provisions. Determine always if the proposed development is actually a substantial damage structure or a substantial improvement, and make sure you're applying your regulations correctly so you stay in compliance with the NFIP. And help communicate to your residents what those standards apply. So if they have to change how they're building when they rebuild, make sure you're doing a good job of communicating to them what those new standards are so they're clear on how to proceed. Really, at the end of the day, you are the gatekeepers to ensure that the development within your floodplain is being done in a way that meets the regulatory requirements that your local community has adopted as part of the program to participate in the NFIP. And really importantly, document your decisions. These are hard times. You can get going really fast, but it's really important that you document your decisions on individual properties, you document your conversations with residents, so that you can show the work you've done down the track when FEMA or the state comes in and does a community assistance process to look at how your community dealt with this situation after a disaster event. And the last is be sure to allow opportunities for conversations. We say appeals here, and it is important that if someone thinks you have not done a substantial damage determination correctly, maybe the aerial imagery looks like everything was destroyed, but it turns out on the ground that's not the case. The main thing is being sure you have a process that they can follow or that's put in place where they can challenge that and have their due process to show why they think that determination is wrong. That's an important aspect to consider. And the last thing I'm going to reiterate again before we wrap up the presentation is that in a flood after fire event, the watershed and the situation that's shown on your flood insurance rate maps has changed for that watershed. So in the next few years, it could be 2 to 5 years or a little longer, the flooding is likely to be a lot worse as the vegetation regrows and as the soil rebounds. It is really like a burned earth or a concrete situation where water will run through it much differently than it did before the fire. Please keep working on flood insurance outreach. Encourage people to purchase flood insurance so that they will be protected, and include people that are outside of the special flood hazard area because that flood risk will be increased. So, apply a buffer with GIS or just look at a broader area and try to convey to them that there is an increased risk, and flood insurance can typically be a lot cheaper if they're not in a special flood hazard area. So it's not nearly the expense they may think to have some extra protection. The other is use your resources that we've provided and talked about here, the FEMA's Substantial Improvement, Substantial Damage Desk Reference Guide. There's also a post-wildfire playbook that the Oregon Silver Jackets team, the Oregon Silver Jackets is a multi-agency partnership with federal and state partners, we put together that provide you a lot of resources on flood risk considerations after a fire and go into other things like erosion and landslides, et cetera. And on that note, there is also a landslide hazard guide that is linked to on our State of Oregon DLCD website. And that is another significant risk as water runs down. It can cause a lot of landslides and different situations after fires. So really know your hazard risks, communicate those to homeowners, and help them protect themselves with flood insurance and be prepared for the upcoming flood season. Well, we want to thank you very much for taking the time to review this presentation. And if you have questions, please feel free to reach out to myself or Mitch with any specific questions or anything theoretical, or to get access to any of the resources we've talked about today.